Slow motion is one of my favorite things to record in video. It was the thing that I really desperately wanted to learn how to do when I first got my camera. But before we talk about slow motion, we need to first understand how a camera's frame rate works and what that means in your camera. Plainly put, your frame rate is how many frames or pictures are in every second of footage. If you want a really clear example of how many frames are per second, you can pause this YouTube video right now. Go ahead, you can pause it. And basically, if you press the period key once it's paused, then you're gonna jump forward 1 frame at a time. If you press the period key 30 times, you're gonna go ahead 30 frames and 1 second will have passed in the video. So that's what 30 frames per second looks like. Let's try and figure out what 10 frames per second looks like. All right, so here's 10 frames per second. It looks like garbage, doesn't it? Here is 15 frames per second. It's getting a little bit better, but it also kind of sucks. Here is 24 frames per second. Now we're starting to get into a familiar territory. And then here is 30 frames per second. Now you can see everything is nice and smooth. 24 frames per second was considered more cinematic and more for film, which is why all of your movies are recorded in 24 frames per second, while 30 frames per second was more so for broadcast and for television, and that's what YouTube and Instagram and Facebook are all optimized for. So if you're shooting a short film or a movie, you might want to consider shooting in 24 frames per second because it will look very nice and cinematic and it'll match what you see in the movies. But for all other applications, I would really recommend shooting in 30 frames per second. So for the rest of this video, we're going to talk about 30 frames per second, and everything that we're shooting is going to be in this 30 frame per second ecosystem or space. Okay, so now here's where things get a little bit more complicated, but try and stay with me. If you set your camera to be shooting at 30 frames per second and you play it back at 30 frames per second, it's just gonna look very normal to you. You can see this clearly with this clip running at 30 frames per second, and it takes 1 second to get through 30 frames of footage. Now, let's take the camera and we'll say, hey, in the same time span, instead of shooting 30 frames per second, I want you to shoot 60 frames per second. Now what you're seeing is we have twice as many frames, but we're still playing it back at 30 frames per second, which means that it's gonna take twice as long to get through the footage, which means that our video is playing back at 50% speed. Once you've imported your footage into an editing software like Premiere, if you highlight all those clips and you right-click, modify, and interpret the footage, instead of it playing back at 60 frames per second, we can make it play back at 30 frames per second, which means that our video is playing back at 50% speed. And that's it for shooting at 60 frames per second. Now let's double it again. Double the frame rate and give it to the next guy. We're gonna try shooting at 120 frames per second. So now what we're doing is we're recording 4 times as many frames as we need to. So in order to show those 120 frames, it's gonna take 4 times as long, which also means that our footage is gonna be 25% of the speed that it should be at. So I hope that you're getting the hang of what we're doing here. The more frames we're adding to our frame rate, then the slower our clip can go. So what we'll do is one last example, and this time we're gonna be shooting at 240 frames per second. That means that we're shooting 16 times the amount of frames that we need to be. So that means our footage is gonna be running at 12.5% speed. So to recap, if you remember my first video on this channel, I mentioned that whatever you set your frame rate to, your shutter speed should be double that number. So if you're shooting in slow motion, refer to this chart to see what you should be setting your shutter speed to. So I'd encourage you to have fun with your shots, mix and match the frame rates, and that kind of covers the basics of slow motion. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this video. Take these tips and take care.